The BBC have produced a Jack the Ripper documentary that employs totally false arguments to support a discredited suspect theory. Can this be true? Should we be surprised? This documentary first aired in 2019 and is called Jack the Ripper, The Case Reopened, and it can be watched still on BBC iPlayer. It's presented by an actress called Emilia Fox, who took the part of a forensic pathologist in the TV drama series Silent Witness. This undoubtedly qualified her to front this particular drama. Emilia Fox was accompanied by Professor David Wilson, a criminologist whose insights are usually worth listening to, although in this case he's shockingly weak on details. For the first 50 minutes they examine the murders and sketch out the profile of that the killer would have to meet in order for him to have been capable of carrying out these audacious and vicious attacks. They went through the case with some good reconstructions, but you should always expect a documentary to take shortcuts and not tell the whole story from every angle, because there simply isn't time, and putting up multiple options would confuse the viewer. And at the end of the day, it's entertainment. This must be taken as read. But I'll point out errors, inaccuracies, flaws and inconsistencies with their conclusions as we go through it. I completely concur with Professor Wilson's initial reaction. In the cases that I've studied or worked on, there's always a pattern to serial murders, and that pattern provides for investigators lots of clues as to who the perpetrator might be. The first expert witness was Dr. Jason Payne James, a forensic physician of high repute, who also appeared in the excellent documentary The Missing Evidence Jack the Ripper. Payne James's suggestions in this documentary are more or less the same as he made in The Missing Evidence. Because that documentary favoured Charles Lechmere as the culprit, Dr. Payne James's conclusions from The Missing Evidence were the subject of intense scrutiny. But not in this instance. Why, one might ask? Quite simply, it's because The Case Reopened favours the establishment suspect, Aaron Kosminski. However, the medical evidence given by Payne James was not Kosminski specific. In The Case Reopened, of the throat wounds, Payne James stated, the lower wound goes through all the tissues to the vertebra, so it goes right through the neck to the backbone. We have two main blood vessels. Those two arteries supply blood to the brain. If those arteries are not supplying blood to the brain, you die. You die within a matter of minutes. So, within minutes of her neck being wounded, Polly would have been dead. The coroner, in his summing up, reflected that when Lechmere and Paul were examining the body, she was only just dead, if life were really extinct. This tells us that either Lechmere killed Polly just before Paul came on the scene, or Kosminski, or whatever phantom suspect you prefer, managed to cunningly escape unseen as Lechmere approached. With respect to the location of the abdominal wounds suffered by Polly Nichols, Payne James accurately described them as being above the victim's hips. These wounds were left covered by the culprit when he left the body, with Polly's dress up to her hips. Polly Nichols, unlike other victims who suffered abdominal wounds, was not left on display. This again suggests that the killer was disturbed, and this can only be Paul disturbing Lechmere, unless you prefer Kosminski or another phantom managing to cunningly escape unseen as Lechmere approached. It's worth incidentally pointing out that Case Reopened ran for an hour, which is 15 minutes longer than The Missing Evidence. Also, Missing Evidence was on commercial television, so there are adverts, and after each break they had to have a short recap. So The Case Reopened had considerably longer in which to make their case. I'm making these comparisons between The Case Reopened and Missing Evidence primarily because some people who inevitably favour Kosminski as the Ripper are obsessed with attacking The Missing Evidence for supposed inaccuracies. Yet these same voices, who portray themselves as neutral seekers for accuracy, have been silent witnesses with regard to the manifest flaws in case reopened, because it comes down in favour of Kosminski. In case you haven't seen the missing evidence, I'll provide a link in the description below. It's aired on various channels many times because it is such a well-made and compelling film, and there'll be a link below to the BBC iPlayer version of Case Reopened as well. Anyway, let's get back to the meat of the Case Reopened. Amelia Fox stated,
Whitechapel was notoriously overcrowded. The people, 78,000 people, were crammed into half a square mile. Yet despite the people, the police, the press, the vigilante groups, the Ripper was able to stalk the streets and not be caught.
This is of course true. It speaks for a suspect who could easily blend in unnoticed and put his victims at their ease. The investigation moved on to the second canonical Ripper victim, Annie Chapman, and they recreated the floor plan of the crime scene, which was a very useful exercise as it highlighted how confined and overlooked the space was. There followed the first blatant factual inaccuracy, which was scripted to come from Amelia Fox.
So Annie was seen between 5 and 5:30 in the morning on Hanbury Street in Whitechapel, and she was seen with a man described as having a shabby, genteel appearance.
This is from the testimony of a witness called Elizabeth Long, who actually said,
it was about 5:30, she was certain of the time, as the brewer's clock had just struck that time as she passed 29 Hanbury Street.
Long was sure the time was 5:30, based on a nearby clock. And she is likely to have been accurate as she was on her way to work and presumably passed by that time every day. So why did Amelia Fox say it was between 5 and 5:30? That's quite a range and is unsupported by Long's testimony. Now, the second expert witness, a former police detective called Peter Blexley, incredulously described the scene at the time of the murder. A bright, clear, sunlit morning with many people in occupation of those two buildings. There was no mention of the earlier time of death suggested by the doctor who conducted the post-mortem, Bagster Phillips, of around 4 a.m. or even earlier, when the killer could have carried out the murder in the dark. Had he been informed of this, it might have appealed to Peter Blexley, just as it seemed to be the more likely time of death to the police in 1888. However, the BBC bent the truth regarding Long's testimony to shoehorn it in with that of another witness, Albert Kadosh. Professor Wilson outlined Kadosh's testimony. He gets up about 5:15 and he comes down to use the toilet. Once he's finished, he then returns to the flat, and as he does so, he hears a woman's voice saying no. Albert Kadosh has been unwell, so he comes back down any minutes later, and when he goes back up to the flat, he hears a thump against the fence, and that thump was undoubtedly the body of Annie Chapman hitting the fence because she's just been murdered by Jack the Ripper. So there's a woman at number 29 who has a woodpacking business, and he presumes that's the noise he's heard, and so he simply goes back into his flat. If Long was so sure that she had seen Chapman outside with her presumed killer at 5:30, Kadosh could not have heard Chapman in the rear yard with her killer soon after 5:15. That's why the BBC changed Long's testimony. Kadosh testified at Annie Chapman's inquest that he had got up at 5:15 and went into the yard of his house. He heard a voice say quite close to him, no. He believed it came from number 29. He went into the house and returned to the yard 3 or 4 minutes afterwards. He then heard a sort of fall against the fence. Witness then left the house and went to work. When he passed Spitalfields Church, it was at around 32 minutes past 5. Spitalfields Church was a few minutes walk away, so Kadosh must have left number 27 before Elizabeth Long passed by, which again means if Kadosh did hear the murder taking place, Long did not see the victim. This is reinforced by Chief Inspector Swanson in a report dated the 19th of October 1888 from Scotland Yard, where he recorded the following timings for Kadosh. 5:25 a.m, 8th of September. Albert Kadosh of 27 Hanbury Street, next door, had occasion to go into the yard. He heard words pass between some persons, apparently at number 29. 5:28 a.m, 8th of September. On Kadosh, going back into the yard again, he heard a noise as of something falling against the fence. This incidentally illustrates that Swanson was very exact in the timings he recorded in his reports. Some like to claim that he went for the nearest 15 minutes. This was because Swanson stated in another report, also filed on the 19th of October 1888, that Charles Cross, who was of course really Charles Lechmere, and Robert Paul, found the body of Polly Nichols at 3:45. Some people want this to have occurred at 3:40. You'll need to watch my other films to understand the nuances around those elusive 5 minutes. But one might think that a criminologist of Wilson's repute, with a nice recreation of Hanbury Street's backyards to work within, might wonder why Kadosh heard an interaction between Chapman and her killer, then went inside only to come back out 3 or 4 minutes later to hear her falling at the moment of death. One wonders what the killer was doing in that time. The act of murder would have only taken less than a minute. Was he chatting casually with Annie on that clear, bright, sunlit morning? And then after Kadosh went inside for the second time, the killer must have tarried a while to mutilate the body, because Annie Chapman was heavily mutilated and left on display. Also, you might notice that in both Kadosh's inquest testimony and Swanson's report, he is less than 100% sure that the conversation he heard came from number 29. Further, Wilson was overstating when he described the noise against the fence as a thump. Lastly, while there was a woman that lived at number 29 who ran a packing case business, Kadosh made no reference to this and didn't say that he thought the noise, which wasn't a thump on the fence, was anything to do with the woodpacking business. These subtle tweaks to the historical narrative alters one's perspective as to what actually transpired. I've bashed Professor Wilson on the detail, but when he got back to generalities, I could only agree with him when he said, "It certainly made me think I would be dealing with a killer who lives very close and who knows that area like the back of his hand." This must be true and effectively discounts suspects with no connection to the East End, such as Druitt, Maybrick or Tumblety, and provide no explanation as to why these murders were committed in that short time frame and in that very tight geographic area. Does it apply to Kosminski? It seems doubtful. He only arrived in London around 1882. His family were from Poland and they emigrated in about 1880 to 81, first to Germany and then to England. Due to mental illness, Kosminski hadn't attempted any work since 1885, so he wouldn't have travelled extensively around the East End for employment reasons. So would he have known the area like the back of his hand, particularly the area around Hanbury Street, when his family connections were all way to the south of Whitechapel Road or Commercial Road? Compare this to a real local, someone like Lechmere, who effectively lived and worked all his life in the area and walked across it to go to work. Professor Wilson isn't describing a suspect like Kosminski, he's describing a suspect like Lechmere. I hope you've enjoyed this episode so far. If so, subscribe, like, comment, carry on watching. They then moved on to the double event murders of Liz Stride and Catherine Eddowes. Amelia Fox described a witness called Israel Schwartz, who claimed to see a man who had an altercation with someone, possibly Liz Stride, on Burner Street, as follows.
He said he was a man of 30 years old, about 5'5", a fair complexion, dark hair with a brown moustache, and that he was wearing a dark jacket with a black peaked cap. And it's so important, this, because this is our first eyewitness identification of who we now think the Ripper is.
Amelia Fox says this is the first eyewitness identification, strangely, because she seemingly is dismissing Elizabeth Long's testimony, and she makes the assumption that the person was seen there was the Ripper. But more importantly, she deliberately missed these bits out of Schwartz's description, with a full face and broad-shouldered. In ripperological circles, the person that Schwartz claimed to have seen is known as the broad-shouldered man. So it's odd that this key physical characteristic was omitted from the documentary. But the obvious explanation for this is that Kosminski's later medical records tell us that he was slight and certainly not broad-shouldered. From Berner Street, the Ripper headed west, where another witness, Joseph Lewende, claimed to have seen the next victim, Catherine Eddowes, with a man, who they presume was also the killer, at the entrance to Mitre Square. I'll say straight away that in my opinion, it's extremely unlikely that any of these witness descriptions are of any use in establishing what the culprit looked like. The witnesses didn't realise they were seeing a significant event at the time, they're at a distance, and the identifications of the victims were carried out with a choice of one at the mortuary. I'll direct viewers to my video called Jack the Ripper Cleared. I'll put that in the link below as well, where I discuss the unreliability of witnesses. Be that as it may, how did Amelia Fox describe the man?
He was approximately 30 years old, 5'7" or 8 inches. He had a fair complexion and a small fair moustache. He described him wearing a salt and pepper jacket, a red neckerchief and a grey peaked cap.
Wilson thought the Schwartz and Lewende physical descriptions were close enough, and the discrepancy in the clothing was explained by he goes home and changes his clothes. Stride only had her throat cut, so it seems unlikely that the murderer would have had any noticeable blood on him at that stage. So why the culprit would need to go home to change his clothes is not explained. Wilson then followed this strange thinking up with one of his interesting insights. I've described that as the difference between killers who are act-focused and killers who are process-focused. If he was simply interested in killing Liz Stride, he'd be act-focused, end of. He would go home. But Jack the Ripper isn't act-focused, he's process-focused, which is why he needs to go and find a second victim. In describing the organ removal suffered by Catherine Eddowes, Amelia Fox incorrectly stated,
"That's the first time we see that in the Ripper killings."
This is incorrect, as in the earlier murder of Annie Chapman, her intestines had been removed from the body and displayed over her right shoulder, and other parts, such as her womb, were missing from the corpse, presumably having been taken away by the killer. These features were undoubtedly part of the process, alongside posing the body, it being left on display to cause shock and awe. They are in common between Chapman and Eddowes, but missing from Nichols and Stride, almost certainly in both the latter cases due to the killer being interrupted. By glossing over the details of the Nichols and Chapman murders, they exaggerated the concept of progression and the murders becoming more extreme as the sequence continued. With Stride, the killer hadn't been seen, and the double event took place in the early hours of Sunday morning, preceding a normal day of rest. That provided opportunity to find another victim. Wilson had provided no insight into why Polly Nichols's abdominal wounds were less extensive, why they were covered, and why she wasn't left on display. With Lechmere as the killer being interrupted and seen by Paul, and he thereafter had no opportunity to sate his unsatisfied urgings, and it's only the Lechmere theory that fits all this template. But again, when discussing the motivation of a serial killer, Wilson was surely close to the mark when he said, "What we see through serial killers killing sequentially is a desire that they have to exercise power and control, a power and control that is usually missing in other aspects of their lives." For the last of the canonical murders, that of Mary Kelly, the documentary team recreated the layout of the crime scene at Miller's Court. The confined space of her room and the folding of her clothes prompted the ex-police detective Peter Blexley to observe of Mary Kelly, "She was clearly comfortable in the company of this man." To which Amelia Fox asked,
"So what does that say about the Ripper himself?"
And Professor Wilson answered, "Well, it tells us that Jack the Ripper, at least initially, was a very plausible punter. He could put the women at ease." Sensible observations, but again, does this describe Kosminski, a recent immigrant from Poland who we know hardly spoke English and who had been suffering from severe mental health issues since 1885? Hardly, but it does describe Lechmere. After Mary Kelly, they backtracked and considered the earlier murder of Martha Tabram, and it was followed up by another strange, unfounded statement by Professor Wilson. The 5 Ripper victims, the canonical 5, the victim turns her back to her killer, and Martha Tabram was killed from the front, so he stabs her face on, which of course means that he's going to be covered in blood. They then use Holmes, the Home Office Large Major Inquiry System, which is used to coordinate modern police investigations, to feed in the Jack the Ripper murder data to see what pattern forms and whether the Martha Tabram murder conforms with that pattern. Wilson is sure that this murder did conform, and I would agree. What links her murder to the canonical 5 is the time of day, the multiple stab wounds, the posing of the body. And then he moved on to more contentious grounds. That fact helps us understand where the killer might have lived, and the way that we do that today is through something called geoprofiling. Geoprofiling just simply tries to use the locations of where the crimes were committed to predict where the offender might actually live. Geoprofiling is a controversial subject as it can lead to mistaken assumptions, as we will see. They discussed 2 types of serial killer: the commuter, who travels to their killing field, and a marauder, who kills around his home in different directions. This obviously hugely simplifies a complex subject. Lechmere, for example, would have been a hybrid of the 2. They took Tabram as the first murder and assumed that the culprit would stick close to home for his own safety and security. Then the various murders set boundaries within which the murders took place, allowing for buffer zones around the offender's home. After dismissing several ludicrous straw man suspects such as Prince Albert Victor, Walter Sickert, James Maybrick and Francis Tumblety, Professor Wilson finally mentions his prime suspect. There is a suspect who you haven't mentioned who fits the bill. Somebody who lives in Whitechapel. Somebody who's low-key enough to avoid bringing too much attention to himself. Someone who's got a reputation for violence, and crucially, he fits all of our cold case criteria. His name is Aaron Kosminski. Amelia Fox added some more detail.
Eyewitnesses believe the Ripper was in his early 30s. Records show that Kosminski was in his mid-20s.
But the record that they used to show that Kosminski was in his mid-20s, actually 26, was from when he was committed to Colney Hatch Lunatic Asylum in 1891. When the murders took place, Kosminski was 22 to 23 years old, in his early 20s. This was blatant dishonesty on the part of the filmmakers. They then claimed that Aaron Kosminski was living at Zion Square, with his brother Wolf and sister Matilda, just a few hundred metres away from where Martha Taborn was murdered and almost on the route between the Liz Stride and Catherine Eddowes murders. Remember, Professor Wilson had that bright idea that the killer had popped home to change his clothes between those two crimes. The trouble is, Aaron Kosminski cannot have lived in Zion Square in 1888. His brother Wolf didn't move there until 1890. In 1888, Wolf lived at 25 Providence Street, some way to the south, while his other brother, Isaac, lived at 74 Greenfield Street, further to the east. For good measure, his sister Matilda and her husband lived at 16 Greenfield Street, and not with Wolf. Was this another blatant act of dishonesty by the programme, or a crass mistake? The fact is, Kosminski certainly didn't live at Zion Square during the murders, and that shoots a huge hole in much of the case made by Professor Wilson. By strange coincidence, when Lechmere was baptised in 1859, his family were living at Zion Square. After these cock-ups, Wilson then embarrassed himself by trying to shoehorn Kosminski into the characteristics he had discussed in the first part of the programme. He claimed Kosminski would know the area well, yet he only moved to Britain around 1882. He admitted that Kosminski had mental health issues from 1885, yet thought he was the type of person who could win the confidence of local prostitutes at the height of the Ripper panic. He claimed that he heard voices, and he would later claim that these voices were telling him to behave in particular violent ways. This is not true. Professor Wilson then claimed the police started to engage in house-to-house inquiries in the wake of the murder of Mary Jane Kelly. And of course, in those house-to-house inquiries, they encounter the Kosminskis. They encounter Aaron Kosminski, and they start to watch him informally. And I think it's that informal surveillance that begins to stop Aaron Kosminski being able to continue to murder. This is another invention. Professor Wilson goes on to mention that Kosminski died in an asylum in 1919, but fails to tell the audience that the police thought he died in the early 1890s, clearly because they'd not kept his location under any scrutiny, and which tells us that he cannot have been a serious police suspect at the time. There are so many serious flaws in this documentary that it's taken some time to thoroughly deconstruct it and expose the BBC's hoax. I'll conduct a more thorough debunking on Kosminski as a suspect as a follow-on film in the way I did about the other discredited police suspect called Michael Ostrog. But this documentary illustrates how information has to be drastically manipulated to make Kosminski a viable suspect. But even with that, the remarkable thing about this documentary is that the suspect it actually describes, without naming him, is Charles Lechmere. I hope you enjoyed this critical examination of Jack the Ripper, the case reopened. Please click on the little bell below to get notified when my next video is released. I've never previously remembered to say that bit. Thank you for watching. As ever, please subscribe, which is free of course, like and share, and comment below with your opinions relating to this film.